Washington, D.C., July 1947. A classified memo circulates inside the Atomic Energy Commission. Its message is direct. It states that no document should be released which refers to experiments with humans, and that any such work should be classified as secret to prevent adverse effects on public opinion or legal suits. That memo was written not by a rogue scientist working alone in a basement. It was written by a colonel inside one of the most powerful government agencies in the United States. And it was followed. What you are about to read is not a collection of conspiracy theories. Every case in this series has been confirmed by congressional testimony, declassified government records, presidential apologies, federal court proceedings, peer-reviewed medical literature, or all of the above. The doctors were real. The agencies were real. The victims were real. 10 experiments. 10 different agencies, methods, and populations. One consistent thread running through all of them: the government decided that certain people were available for use. Here is what they did. Experiment 1. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study. 40 years of deliberate neglect. 1932 to 1972. In 1932, the United States was deep in the Great Depression. Money was short everywhere, including inside the federal government. The U.S. Public Health Service had been running a program to treat syphilis in poor black communities across the rural South. When funding dried up, they shut the treatment program down. But instead of simply walking away, they replaced it with something else entirely. A study that would watch men die from a treatable disease for the next 4 decades, while telling those men they were receiving care. Macon County, Alabama was chosen as the location. The county was 82% black. Most residents were sharecroppers, men who worked land they did not own, paid a portion of their crops as rent, and lived in poverty so deep that a visit to a doctor was a luxury most had never experienced. The U.S. Public Health Service chose this county specifically because surveys showed that roughly 35% of its male population was infected with syphilis. It was, in the words of one government official at the time, an ideal location to study the natural history of the disease in the African American male uninfluenced by treatment. 600 men were recruited. 399 had syphilis. 201 did not and served as a comparison group. The men were told they were being treated for bad blood, a term commonly used in the area at the time to describe a range of ailments including anemia, fatigue, and general poor health. The government doctors never told these men they had syphilis. They never explained what syphilis does to the human body. They never mentioned that the disease, if left untreated, moves through the body in stages, damaging the heart, the brain, the nervous system, and eventually killing the person who carries it. To get the men to show up and keep showing up, the Public Health Service offered incentives: free physical examinations, free meals on examination days, free burial insurance, a significant offer to men who had almost nothing. The study was originally described to the men as lasting 6 months. It lasted 40 years. Syphilis was not a new or mysterious disease in 1932. Doctors already knew it was treatable. Heavy metal compounds, arsenic-based drugs, and bismuth were the standard treatments of the era. They were not perfect, but they worked well enough to reduce the severity of the disease and slow its progression. The Public Health Service knew this. Their own doctors had used these treatments in the earlier program they shut down. But the Tuskegee study was designed around non-treatment. The whole point was to watch what the disease did when nothing was done about it. So from the beginning, the men received no treatment for syphilis. They received aspirin. They received vitamins. They received iron tonic. None of it does anything for syphilis. Then, in the mid-1940s, something changed that made the study even harder to justify, and that the government chose to ignore entirely. Penicillin was discovered to be a safe, reliable, and highly effective cure for syphilis. By 1947, it had become the standard treatment. By the late 1940s, it was widely available across the United States. The Public Health Service knew this too. Their own medical experts knew it, and they made a deliberate decision. The men in Tuskegee would not receive penicillin. They would not be told penicillin existed. The study would continue. To make sure the men stayed sick, the Public Health Service did not simply withhold treatment inside the study. They actively worked to block treatment from the outside as well. In 1934, they gave lists of the study participants to local doctors in Macon County and asked those doctors not to treat these men for syphilis. In 1940, when the Alabama Health Department brought a mobile venereal disease unit into Macon County, Public Health Service officials contacted the health department and told them to deny treatment to the study subjects. The Alabama Health Department complied. Then World War II arrived. In 1941 and 1942, several hundred of the study participants registered with the local Selective Service Board for the military draft. When these men had their entrance medical examinations, the Army discovered their syphilis and ordered them to begin treatment immediately before they could be inducted into military service. The Public Health Service contacted the draft board directly. They provided a list of 256 men enrolled in the study and requested that these men be exempted from the treatment requirement. The draft board agreed. The men were kept out of the military and kept away from the treatment that would have cured them, so the study could go on. Between those three moves, the letters to local doctors in 1934, the instruction to the Alabama Health Department in 1940, and the intervention with the draft board in 1941 and 1942, the true nature of the study had become undeniable. This was not passive observation of a disease's natural course. The government was intervening repeatedly and aggressively, not to help the men, but to make sure they stayed sick. The study continued publishing results in medical journals throughout its entire run. Papers appeared in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1936, in the American Journal of Syphilis in 1950 and 1953, in the Journal of Chronic Disease in 1955 and 1956, and in the Archives of Internal Medicine in 1964. The 1964 paper was titled The Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis, the 30th Year of Observation. The titles alone were enough to tell any reader exactly what was happening. The study was not hidden from the medical community. 13 papers were published across its 4-decade run. Very few people in the medical establishment raised any objection. Inside the Public Health Service, one man did. Peter Buxton was 28 years old and working as a venereal disease investigator for the agency in San Francisco when he heard about the Tuskegee study from a coworker in 1965. He later said he did not want to believe it. In November 1966, he filed a formal written protest with the Public Health Service's Division of Venereal Diseases, raising ethical objections to the study. His superiors rejected the protest on the grounds that the study was not yet complete. He filed a second protest in November 1968. This time, he pointed out that the country was in the middle of racial and civil rights upheaval, and that a study of this nature, conducted on 600 black men, all of them denied treatment, all of them deceived, was, in his words, political dynamite. His supervisors convened a panel of doctors to review his complaints. That panel voted to continue the study. Buxton left the Public Health Service and enrolled in law school. But the study stayed with him. In 1972, he passed documents about the study to Edith Lederer, an Associated Press reporter he knew in San Francisco. Lederer gave the documents to a colleague in Washington, investigative reporter Jean Heller, telling her she thought there might be something there. Heller investigated, and on July 25, 1972, her story ran in the Washington Star under the headline, "Syphilis Victims in U.S. Study Went Untreated for 40 Years." The following morning, it was on the front page of the New York Times. The public reaction was immediate and fierce. Congress held hearings. Senator Ted Kennedy led the questioning. Officials from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare testified. Peter Buxton testified. 4 months after the story broke, on November 16, 1972, the study was officially terminated. By that point, 28 of the men had died directly from syphilis. 100 more had died from complications related to the disease. 40 of their wives had been infected. 19 of their children had been born with congenital syphilis, meaning they came into the world already carrying the infection their fathers had never been told they had. In 1973, attorney Fred Gray filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of the study participants and their families. The following year, in 1974, the federal government settled out of court for $10 million. Under the settlement terms, living men who had been in the infected group received $37,500 each. The families of men who had died received $15,000. Men in the uninfected control group received $16,000. The heirs of men in the control group who had died received $5,000. No one was ever prosecuted. Not a single doctor or official faced criminal charges for what had been done. Congress passed the National Research Act in 1974, creating new legal requirements for the protection of people in medical research studies, including mandatory informed consent. In 1979, the federal government published the Belmont Report, which established core ethical principles for research involving human subjects. Principles so basic that it is difficult to read them without recognizing how completely the Tuskegee study had violated every one of them. In May 1997, President Bill Clinton invited 5 of the surviving study participants to the White House. At a formal ceremony, he issued an official presidential apology on behalf of the United States government. He called what had been done to the men shameful and clearly racist. Herman Shaw, then 94 years old, was one of the men who sat on the stage that day. He had enrolled in the study in 1932 at the age of 28. He had spent 40 years believing he was receiving care. He had received nothing. The last surviving participant in the study died in January 2004. The last widow receiving benefits from the study's health program died in January 2009. A 2016 study published by researchers at Harvard and the University of Wisconsin found that the public exposure of the Tuskegee study in 1972 had measurable effects on the health of black men across the United States for years afterward. Black men who were 45 years old at the time of the 1972 disclosure, old enough to remember and process what it meant, visited doctors less frequently in the years that followed. Their life expectancy at age 45 fell by up to 1.4 years compared to white men of the same age. The researchers estimated that this reduction in medical engagement accounted for approximately 35% of the life expectancy gap between black and white men in 1980. The damage did not end when the study ended. It spread outward, quietly, for decades. What the Tuskegee study permanently established was not simply that individual doctors had behaved badly. It established that the federal government's own public health apparatus, the agency whose stated mission was to protect the health of the American people, had run a program for 40 years in which black men were lied to, denied a cure, blocked from outside treatment, and watched until they died. The study was not a secret operation conducted by rogue actors in the dark. It was published in journals, supervised by rotating teams of public health officials, and reviewed repeatedly at the organizational level. 13 times, researchers published papers about it, and 13 times, the medical establishment read those papers and said nothing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The men of Macon County were not the only people the U.S. government quietly subjected to medical experiments during this period. While the Public Health Service was watching syphilis run its course through sharecroppers in Alabama, other arms of the government were conducting entirely different kinds of experiments on soldiers, on prisoners, on patients in hospital beds who had no idea what was being injected into them. Experiment 2, Project MK-Ultra, the CIA's secret war on the American mind, 1953 to 1973. In the early 1950s, the United States was deep into the Cold War. American soldiers had recently returned from Korea, and some of them had come back saying things that disturbed military officials. North Korea and China had paraded captured American pilots on camera, making public confessions, claiming they had used biological weapons during the war. The U.S. government believed the confessions were forced. The question that haunted intelligence officials was simple. How had they done it? Had the enemy found a way to break a person's mind and replace what was inside it with something else? That fear became the foundation for one of the most extensive and illegal programs the U.S. government ever ran on its own people. On April 13, 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles formally approved a program called Project MK-Ultra. The man put in charge of running it was Sidney Gottlieb, a 34-year-old chemist who worked in the CIA's technical services staff. Gottlieb had a club foot and a stutter. He was also, by the accounts of everyone who knew the program, the most dangerous scientist the agency ever employed. His goal was straightforward: find a way to control a human mind, wipe out what was already there, put something new in its place. The primary tool he believed could do this was LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, a synthetic drug that had been discovered by a Swiss chemist in 1943 and that, in even tiny doses, caused extreme hallucinations, distorted thinking, and complete disorientation. In 1953, Gottlieb arranged for the CIA to spend $240,000 to purchase the entire existing world supply of LSD from Sandoz Laboratories in Switzerland. The agency later arranged for the pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly to replicate the formula, giving the CIA an unlimited domestic supply. Gottlieb then began distributing LSD to hospitals, clinics, prisons, and research institutions across the country, funneling the money through fake charitable foundations, so the receiving institutions had no idea the CIA was behind the funding. MK-Ultra eventually grew into 149 separate sub-projects. It operated inside more than 80 institutions, including universities, hospitals, prisons, and military facilities. Some of the researchers involved knew they were working for the CIA. Many did not. The experiments ran the full range from electroshock therapy, hypnosis, and sensory deprivation to the forced administration of heroin, barbiturates, amphetamines, mescaline, and psilocybin. The explicit goal across all of it was the same: to find out whether a human being's will could be destroyed and then reconstructed by an outside force. Most of the people subjected to these experiments were not told what was happening to them. One of the clearest examples of what this looked like in practice was at the Public Health Service Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky. The facility was officially described as a treatment center for people with drug addictions. In reality, it functioned as a prison. The research director there was Dr. Harris Isbell, a pharmacologist who spent nearly 2 decades running drug experiments on the patients in his care. Isbell was funded by the CIA through the National Institute of Mental Health, with the CIA connection kept hidden from the public record. Isbell's patients were almost entirely black men who had been arrested for drug offenses. He offered them a deal: participate in drug experiments and receive doses of heroin or morphine as payment. Because these men were addicts in a facility that was supposedly treating their addiction, the offer was not easily refused. Word spread through the criminal underworld that if your heroin supply ran low on the outside, you could commit yourself to Lexington and get your fix by volunteering. The facility had a recidivism rate of roughly 90%. What Isbell did with this captive population went far beyond basic research. In one experiment, he administered LSD to 7 black men for 77 consecutive days. As the men built up a tolerance to the drug, Isbell doubled the dose, then tripled it, then quadrupled it. In his own research notes, he wrote that this type of behavior, meaning the men's continued endurance, was to be expected in patients of this type. In 1975, when he was called before a Senate subcommittee to answer for what he had done, Isbell told the committee, "The ethical codes were not so highly developed, and there was a great need to know." He added that he personally thought they had done a very excellent job. A different arm of MK Ultra was running simultaneously in San Francisco. In 1954, the CIA launched a sub-program called Operation Midnight Climax. The man placed in charge of it on the ground was George Hunter White, a former Army intelligence officer and federal narcotics agent. White set up a CIA-funded safe house at 225 Chestnut Street in San Francisco. He decorated it deliberately to look like a cheap apartment: Toulouse-Lautrec prints on the walls, fake bohemian furnishings, a fully stocked bar. Behind one of the walls, he installed a two-way mirror. On the other side of that mirror was a concealed observation room where CIA operatives could sit, watch, and take notes without being seen. Women on the CIA payroll were sent out to find men in bars and on the street and bring them back to the apartment. The men were given drinks that had been spiked with LSD. None of them were told. None of them consented. White sat on the other side of the mirror and watched what happened, drinking martinis and recording his observations. When construction workers renovated one of these San Francisco safe houses decades later, they found microphones and recording wires still embedded in the walls. The program was not limited to random members of the public. MK Ultra tested LSD on CIA employees, military personnel, and prisoners across the country. At the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in 1957, a prisoner named James Bulger was told he was participating in an experiment to find a cure for schizophrenia. He agreed. He was then given LSD on a near-daily basis for an extended period. Bulger later wrote about what he experienced. He described 8 convicts in a panic and paranoid state. He wrote about hallucinating blood coming out of the walls. He wrote about watching other men turn into skeletons in front of him. He wrote that he felt he was going insane. Bulger later became known as the Boston crime boss Whitey Bulger. He spent the rest of his life saying that what the government did to him in that prison was a greater crime than anything he had ever committed. On November 18, 1953, Gottlieb organized a working retreat at a cabin at Deep Creek Lake in rural Maryland. 10 people attended, a mix of CIA officers and Army scientists from Fort Detrick, the military's biological weapons research facility. After dinner, Gottlieb mixed a bottle of Cointreau liqueur. He had dissolved LSD into it beforehand. 8 of the 10 men at the table drank from that bottle without being told what was in it. One of those men was Frank Olson, a 43-year-old Army bacteriologist who worked with biological weapons at Fort Detrick. 9 days after drinking that glass of liqueur, on November 28, 1953, Frank Olson fell from the 10th floor window of the Hotel Statler in New York City. He died on impact. The CIA's initial explanation was that Olson had suffered a mental breakdown and jumped. They said nothing publicly about the LSD.
Olson's family was told as little as possible. The case was officially closed as a suicide.
Then, in 1975, the Rockefeller Commission, a presidential investigation into illegal CIA activities, revealed that Olson had been secretly dosed with LSD before his death. President Gerald Ford met personally with Olson's family to apologize. The government settled with the family for $750,000. In 1994, Olson's family had his body exhumed for a second autopsy. The forensic examination found injuries on the body that were consistent with a blow to the head, injuries that would have occurred before the fall, not during it. Whether Olson jumped or was pushed has never been officially resolved. The CIA destroyed most of its records before anyone could find out. The destruction of records is its own part of this story. In 1973, as the Watergate scandal was consuming the Nixon administration and congressional investigators were beginning to look at intelligence agency abuses, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered that all MK Ultra files be destroyed. The order was carried out. Boxes of documents were shredded. Tapes were wiped. The CIA's own internal investigation later concluded that the destruction had been thorough enough to make a complete accounting of the program impossible. What saved any record of MK Ultra at all was a filing error. In 1977, a Freedom of Information Act request by a journalist turned up 7 boxes of documents that had been misfiled in a financial records building at the CIA and missed during the purge. Those boxes contained records on 149 sub-projects, the names of 185 researchers and institutions that had participated, and enough detail to make clear the full scale of what had been done. That discovery prompted a second round of Senate hearings in 1977, this time led by Senator Ted Kennedy. CIA Director Stansfield Turner testified that he was horrified by what the documents showed. The agency said it would try to identify surviving subjects and consider what responsibility the government owed them. No one was ever prosecuted. Not Gottlieb, not Isbell, not White, not any of the 185 researchers named in the recovered documents. Gottlieb retired from the CIA in 1973, moved to Virginia, raised goats, ate yogurt, and later volunteered as a speech therapist in schools. He died in 1999. The subjects who had been dosed in the safe houses, the prisons, the hospitals, and the university labs were never systematically located or compensated. The 1977 Senate report acknowledged that, given the destruction of records, the full number of people affected and the full number of deaths would never be known. In 1976, President Gerald Ford signed an executive order prohibiting drug experimentation on human subjects without written, informed consent. The order came 23 years after the CIA had started doing exactly that. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Tuskegee study and MK Ultra were run by different agencies with different stated purposes. But what happened in the San Francisco safe houses and what happened in the Lexington prison ward shared the same foundation as what happened in Macon County, Alabama. The government deciding that certain categories of people were available for use. While the CIA was running LSD through the veins of prisoners and bar patrons, another arm of the U.S. military was conducting a different kind of experiment entirely. One that took place not in a hospital or a brothel, but in the open air above an American city, where 800,000 people were breathing. Experiment 3. Operation Sea Spray, the day the U.S. Navy turned San Francisco into a biological weapons test site. 1950. The U.S. biological weapons program began in 1943 at a facility in Frederick, Maryland called Camp Detrick. President Roosevelt had authorized it after scientists warned that Germany and Japan were developing biological weapons and that the United States had no equivalent program and no defense against one. By the end of World War II, the facility employed thousands of researchers and had produced stockpiles of anthrax, botulinum toxin, and other pathogens. The weapons were never used during the war, but the research did not stop when the war ended. It expanded. By the late 1940s, the people running the biological weapons program at Camp Detrick, which had been renamed Fort Detrick by 1956, had developed a new set of questions. They knew biological weapons worked inside laboratories. They knew what the pathogens did to animals in controlled environments. What they did not know was how well a biological weapon would actually spread across a real city with real weather, real wind patterns, and 800,000 people moving through the streets. To find that out, they decided to test it on an actual city, without telling anyone. In August 1949, before the San Francisco test, the Army ran its first trial. A team from Fort Detrick's Special Operations Division disguised themselves as maintenance workers and entered the Pentagon, the largest office building in the world. They released bacteria into the building's air conditioning and ventilation system and observed as the microbes spread throughout all 5 sections of the structure. The Pentagon test confirmed what they had suspected. Bacteria could be introduced covertly into an enclosed building and dispersed invisibly to every person inside. The next question was whether the same thing could be done outdoors across an entire city. In April 1950, Navy warships sprayed the cities of Norfolk, Hampton, and Newport News in Virginia with an anthrax simulant, a substance designed to behave like anthrax bacteria but not cause the disease. The results were recorded. Then, the program moved west. The city selected for the next test was San Francisco. The military chose it for specific reasons. It was a major coastal port. Its bay and fog patterns created conditions that would show exactly how a biological weapon released from a ship offshore would behave when it drifted inland over a dense urban population. If an enemy wanted to attack a city from the sea, San Francisco was the kind of target they would pick. The Army wanted to know how catastrophic that attack could be. On September 20th, 1950, a U.S. Navy vessel began sailing a course just off the San Francisco coast. The ship was equipped with aerosol generators. For the next 8 days, continuing until September 27th, the ship released clouds of bacteria into the air approximately 2 miles offshore. 2 types of bacteria were used. One was Bacillus globigii. The other was Serratia marcescens, a microorganism that produces a distinctive red pigment, making it easy to track and identify in samples. Both were considered harmless to humans at the time. The Army had set up monitoring equipment at 43 locations across the city to track the spread of the bacteria. The results were unambiguous. The bacterial cloud drifted in from the coast, carried on the same winds and fog patterns that any attacking force would rely on. It spread not only across San Francisco, but into surrounding suburbs, traveling as far as 23 miles inland. Based on the data from those 43 sampling stations, Army scientists calculated that nearly every one of San Francisco's 800,000 residents had inhaled at least 5,000 particles of Serratia marcescens during the hours the bacteria were airborne. For context, 5,000 particles per person is within the estimated range of what it would take to cause infection with anthrax. The Army considered the test a success. Their internal conclusion, recorded in a classified report, was that a successful biological warfare attack on San Francisco could be launched from the sea, and that effective dosages could be produced over large areas of the city. Nobody in San Francisco knew any of this was happening. 3 weeks after the spraying ended, on October 11, 1950, 11 residents of San Francisco checked into Stanford Hospital, which at that time was still located in the city, with urinary tract infections of a type the hospital had never seen before. The bacteria causing the infections was identified as Serratia marcescens, the same bacteria the Navy had just sprayed across the city. Stanford doctors had never documented a single Serratia marcescens infection in the hospital's history before that month. The outbreak was so unusual that they wrote it up in the American Medical Association's Archives of Internal Medicine, so other physicians would know what they were looking at. 10 of the 11 patients recovered. The 11th was a 75-year-old man named Edward Nevin. Nevin had recently undergone prostate surgery and was in a vulnerable state when his urinary tract infection took hold. The bacteria spread from his urinary tract to his heart. He developed endocarditis, an infection of the heart valves. He died on November 1, 1950, 3 weeks after checking into the hospital. He became the first recorded death associated with the San Francisco test. The Navy and the Army knew about the outbreak. They recorded the pneumonia cases in the city in the period following the test. Army officials later acknowledged in Senate testimony that they had noted the Serratia marcescens outbreak at Stanford Hospital after the test. They called it a coincidence. They said the source of the hospital infections was almost certainly inside the hospital itself, not the air over the city. They continued using Serratia marcescens as a simulant in subsequent tests. Edward Nevin had a grandson, also named Edward Nevin. In 1981, 31 years after his grandfather's death, the grandson filed a lawsuit against the federal government in U.S. District Court. He argued that the Navy's spray had introduced the bacteria into the San Francisco air, that his grandfather had inhaled it, and that the infection that killed him was a direct result of the government's secret test. The case went to trial. The judge filled the jury box with members of the press because there was enough public interest to warrant it. Scientists from Harvard testified on the family's behalf, arguing that the timing and the rarity of the outbreak made the connection to the spray test highly probable. The government won. The lower court ruled that the family could not conclusively prove the bacteria in Edward Nevin's blood was the same strain the Navy had released over the city. The Nevins appealed. They lost again at the Ninth Circuit. They appealed all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court declined to hear the case. The ruling that held throughout the entire legal process was that the federal government was immune from negligence claims in cases involving military activities, regardless of the harm caused to civilians. The family received nothing. Operation Sea Spray was not an isolated experiment. It was one entry in a program that ran for 20 years across hundreds of locations in the United States. In 1977, the Army disclosed to a Senate subcommittee that between 1949 and 1969, open-air biological tests had been conducted 239 times. In 80 of those tests, live bacteria were used, bacteria that researchers at the time believed were harmless. In the remaining tests, inert chemical particles were used as stand-ins for biological agents. The full scope of where and how those 239 tests were conducted makes clear that San Francisco was only the beginning. In 1953, the Army ran a program called the St. Joe Program, in which operatives drove cars through the streets of St. Louis, Minneapolis, and Winnipeg, Canada, with aerosol generators mounted on the rooftops. They sprayed zinc-cadmium sulfide, a chemical particle used to simulate the spread of a biological weapon, through residential neighborhoods. Local governments were told the spraying was an invisible smokescreen being deployed to mask cities from enemy radar. That was not true. Zinc cadmium sulfide is now a confirmed carcinogen. In 1957, the first large area coverage test involved dispersing microorganisms in a swath running from South Dakota down through Minnesota. Monitoring equipment tracked the particles as they traveled. Some were detected more than 1,200 miles away.
The Army's own written assessment of that test stated that it had proved the feasibility of covering large areas of the country with biological weapons agents. In May 1965, members of Fort Detrick's Special Operations Division spread bacteria throughout Washington's National Airport and its adjacent Greyhound bus terminal. More than 130 passengers were exposed to the bacteria and then boarded buses and planes that took them to 39 cities across 7 states in the 2 weeks that followed. In June 1966, Army operatives carried out a test inside the New York City subway system. They dropped light bulbs filled with Bacillus subtilis onto the tracks at stations in Midtown Manhattan. A participant named Wally Panyer later said the bacteria spread pretty well because a natural aerosol was produced every few minutes by each passing train. None of the passengers in Washington were told. None of the subway riders in New York were told. Nobody in St. Louis or Minneapolis was told. The people of San Francisco in 1950 were not told. The standard position held by Army officials across all of these tests was the same one they had applied to Edward Nevin. The bacteria were believed to be harmless. The tests were necessary for national security, and any illnesses that followed were coincidental. The American public did not learn that any of these tests had taken place until 1977, 27 years after Edward Nevin died, when Army officials testified before a Senate subcommittee and disclosed the existence of the program. By then, most of the records from the tests had been classified or destroyed. The commanders who had ordered the San Francisco test had long since retired. The doctor at Fort Detrick's Naval Biological Laboratory who, according to a naval employee speaking decades later, had privately told his staff that the 1950 test had probably caused a man's death, and that anyone who ever spoke about it publicly would find that the Navy would make sure they could never find work again. That doctor was never named in any congressional hearing. No one was ever charged with anything in connection with Operation Sea Spray or any of the 238 other open-air tests. President Nixon formally ended the U.S. offensive biological weapons program on November 25, 1969, in a speech delivered from Fort Detrick itself. He called it unprecedented. He pledged that the United States would confine its biological research from that point forward to defensive work only. Vaccines, safety measures, detection. The program that had run for 26 years had sprayed bacteria across American cities 239 times and had classified every record it produced from public view was declared over. The people who had been breathing those clouds in San Francisco, St. Louis, Minneapolis, New York, and Washington had never been asked. They had never been told. And not one of them, in the entire 26-year run of the program, had ever been warned that the fog rolling in off the bay or the exhaust drifting from a passing car might be something other than what it appeared to be. While Operation Sea Spray exposed an entire city to bacteria from the outside in, another government program running at exactly the same time was doing something more targeted, not releasing substances into a city's air, but injecting them directly into individual human bodies, chosen specifically because they were poor, sick, and unable to fight back. Experiment 4. The Manhattan Project's human plutonium injections. 18 Americans, 0 consent. 1945 to 1947. Plutonium was first created in a laboratory at the University of California, Berkeley in 1940. It did not exist in nature in any meaningful quantity, It was synthesized, built atom by chemists working with a particle accelerator called a cyclotron. By 1945, the Manhattan Project had built industrial-scale production facilities that were churning out plutonium in quantities large enough to build nuclear weapons, and 2 of the 3 atomic bombs assembled during the war used plutonium as their core material. The men running the Manhattan Project knew, in general terms, that plutonium was dangerous. They knew radiation caused harm. Radium workers in the 1920s had developed bone cancers and died gruesome deaths. Early researchers had learned through accident and observation that radioactive materials concentrated in bone tissue stayed there for years and disrupted the body from the inside. By 1944, contamination at Manhattan Project facilities had become serious enough that Arthur Compton, the head of the project's Chicago laboratory, described plutonium in writing as potentially extremely poisonous. What nobody knew precisely was how much plutonium it took to cause what kind of damage, how long it stayed in the body, and whether there was a safe exposure level below which workers could operate. The animal experiments they had run, injecting plutonium into rats and observing the results, gave them some data, but the scientists argued the results were too limited and too slow. They wanted human data. They decided they would get it by injecting patients in hospitals with plutonium without telling those patients what was being put in their bodies. In April 1945, the 4 senior medical officers overseeing health and safety across the Manhattan Project, Stafford Warren at Oak Ridge, Robert Stone in Chicago, Joseph Hamilton at Berkeley, and Louis Hempelman at Los Alamos, collectively approved a plan to begin human injection experiments. The plan was also approved by Manhattan Project Director J. Robert Oppenheimer. The injections would be given to patients already in hospitals, patients already believed to be terminally ill. The logic was straightforward. If these people were going to die anyway, there was nothing to lose by injecting them with plutonium and collecting their urine and stool samples to see how much of the substance their bodies retained and how quickly it was excreted. Not a single patient was told what was being injected into them. Not a single patient signed an informed consent form. The word plutonium was classified information. The general public did not even know the element existed. The patients were given code names inside Manhattan Project documents. Their medical records at the hospitals where they were treated contained no mention of the injections at all. The decision to keep the injection records entirely separate from the official hospital charts was made deliberately by Stafford Warren himself. There were 2 parallel sets of records, what the hospital knew and what the Manhattan Project knew. The patient knew neither. The first person injected was Ebb Cade. Cade was a 53-year-old black man who worked as a cement mixer for a construction company at the Oak Ridge facility in Tennessee. On March 23, 1945, he was on his way to work when he was involved in a traffic accident. The crash fractured his right kneecap, his right forearm and wrist bones, and his left thigh bone. He was taken to the Manhattan Project Army Hospital at Oak Ridge. Doctors examined him and found that, apart from his injuries, he was healthy. No serious illness, no history of disease, eating well, in good physical condition. He was, in the clinical assessment of Dr. Heimer Friedel, the deputy medical director of the Manhattan Engineer District, a well-developed, well-nourished man. Friedel recorded him as a colored male. On April 10, 1945, while Cade was still lying in the hospital with unset fractures, doctors secretly injected him with 4.7 micrograms of plutonium-239. They then waited. For 5 days, they collected everything Cade excreted, urine and stool, and shipped the samples to Los Alamos for analysis, measuring how much plutonium his body was holding on to and how much it was releasing. Then they performed additional procedures on Cade that had nothing to do with treating his injuries. They did not set his broken bones until April 15th, 5 days after the injection, and before setting them, they cut samples from the bone tissue to test how much plutonium had migrated into the bone in those 5 days. Then, they extracted 15 of his teeth. The teeth were sampled for plutonium content. Cade was never told why any of this was being done. At some point, Cade figured out that something was wrong. According to one account given by a nurse, she opened his hospital room door one morning and he was gone. He had left during the night without telling anyone. He moved out of Tennessee entirely, relocated to North Carolina, and never spoke publicly about what had happened to him at Oak Ridge. He died of heart failure in Greensboro on April 13, 1953, 8 years after the injection. The third subject was a 58-year-old house painter named Albert Stevens. Stevens checked into the University of California Hospital in San Francisco in May 1945 because he believed he had stomach cancer. His doctors agreed. They told him he had 6 months to live. The diagnosis was wrong. A biopsy would later show he had a large, benign gastric ulcer, not cancer. But before that biopsy result came back, doctors in Joseph Hamilton's research group at Berkeley had already prepared a dose of plutonium-238, an isotope 276 times more radioactive than plutonium-239, chosen because its decay was easier to measure with available instruments. On May 14, 1945, Albert Stevens was given that injection without his knowledge. When the biopsy confirmed there was no cancer, the doctors faced a decision. They could tell Stevens what had happened. They could inform him he did not have cancer, that he had been injected with a radioactive substance under a false medical premise, and that the injection was not therapeutic in any way. Instead, they told him nothing. They told him his recovery was extraordinary. They offered him a stipend to stay in the San Francisco area so the lab could continue collecting urine and stool samples to track the plutonium in his system. Stevens accepted, assuming his continued monitoring was part of post-cancer care. For the next 2 decades, he regularly provided samples. He went to his grave in 1966, 21 years after the injection, never knowing he did not have cancer, never knowing what had been put inside him. His sister, a nurse, grew suspicious over the years but never got answers. Stevens absorbed more radiation over his lifetime than any other human being in recorded history, a cumulative effective dose of 64 sieverts, which is roughly 1,280 times the annual limit now permitted for a radiation worker in the United States. In April 1946, the experiments reached further. A 4-year-old boy named Simeon Shaw was suffering from bone cancer in New South Wales, Australia. His parents were told by a physician in Australia that there was a cutting-edge treatment available in the United States that might help their son. The family flew to San Francisco on a U.S. military plane. The child was admitted to the University of California Hospital, where he was separated from his mother for periods of time and seen by Hamilton's team. He received a plutonium injection. His parents were told the injection was part of his cancer treatment. Researchers also removed part of the boy's tumor tissue and sent it to the laboratory to measure plutonium content. Within a month, the family was sent back to Australia. No follow-up was ever conducted. Simeon Shaw died in January 1947, 8 months after the injection. His parents did not find out until 30 years later that their son had been used as a plutonium test subject. Across the country, similar injections were being carried out at Strong Memorial Hospital in Rochester, New York, and at Billings Hospital at the University of Chicago. At Rochester alone, 11 people received plutonium injections. 6 patients at Rochester were also injected with uranium, with the specific research goal of identifying the minimum dose
that would produce detectable kidney damage. That was not a study designed to help patients. It was a study designed to find out at what point uranium begins to destroy a kidney. At least one patient at Rochester, Ida Schultz Charlton, a 49-year-old woman admitted for unusual swelling, received a plutonium injection 3 weeks after her arrival. She was not terminally ill. She was not even chronically ill. Researchers later noted in internal documents that her regular, healthy metabolism made her an ideal case study for how a non-sick person excretes plutonium. Her 314 pages of official hospital medical records contain no mention of the plutonium injection anywhere. The records existed only in Manhattan Project files. In December 1946, the Manhattan Project ordered a temporary halt to the human injections. The following month, April 1947, with the Nuremberg doctors' trial underway in Germany, in which Nazi physicians were being prosecuted for conducting experiments on concentration camp prisoners without consent, a new internal guideline was issued suggesting that patients should be told they were receiving an unknown substance and that no one knew what it did. The injections continued anyway. A 36-year-old man named Elmer Allen received a plutonium injection and had his left leg amputated shortly afterward. The leg tissue was sent to the lab. Allen lived for decades afterward, never fully informed of what had been done. The experiments were covered up for nearly 50 years. In 1986, a congressional report by Massachusetts Representative Edward Markey outlined the existence of human radiation experiments funded by the federal government, but it generated little public attention. The real exposure came in 1993. Eileen Wellsome, a reporter at the Albuquerque Tribune, had spent 6 years tracking a footnote she had stumbled upon in a classified document at Kirtland Air Force Base in 1987, a reference to human subjects in plutonium tests identified only by code names. She tracked down the actual identities of 5 of the 18 subjects, obtained their medical records, and found their surviving families. On November 15, 1993, the Tribune published her 3-part series naming names and telling stories. The paper had a circulation of 35,000. Within days, every major news organization in the country was calling. Wellsome later won the Pulitzer Prize for the work. Energy Secretary Hazel O'Leary declared herself appalled and launched what she called an openness initiative, beginning the process of declassifying millions of documents held by the Department of Energy and its predecessor agencies. President Clinton created the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, which spent 2 years reviewing the records and published its final report in 1996. In October 1995, Clinton issued a formal apology, though, as Wellsome later noted, it was delivered on the same day the O.J. Simpson jury returned its verdict and barely registered in the news cycle. The federal government eventually paid $4.8 million in settlements to 12 of the 18 plutonium subjects or their families. Not one of the doctors or scientists who ordered or administered the injections was ever prosecuted or formally sanctioned. What the plutonium experiments established permanently was the template for the cover-up. The decision made in 1945 to keep injection records out of official hospital charts, made deliberately at the highest level of the medical program, meant that none of the patients had any way of knowing what had been done to them, even if they had thought to look. The government maintained that secrecy for 48 years. The reason it ended was not a congressional investigation or an internal whistleblower. It was a reporter at a small afternoon newspaper in New Mexico who spent 6 years chasing a footnote on her own time. The plutonium injections targeted people who were already sick, already inside the medical system, and already dependent on doctors they trusted to tell them the truth. What happened to the soldiers in the next experiment on this list required a different kind of selection, not finding the sick and the vulnerable, but choosing men based entirely on the color of their skin. Experiment 5.
The race-based mustard gas experiments. How the U.S. military chose its soldiers by skin color, 1942 to 1945. Mustard gas was not a new weapon in World War II. It had been used extensively during World War I, and the men who survived exposure to it came back with burned lungs, destroyed skin, and permanent respiratory damage that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. By the time the United States entered World War II in December 1941, military commanders knew exactly what mustard gas did to a human body. They had detailed records from the previous war. They had photographs of the damage. What they told themselves they did not know, or at least not precisely enough, was how well protective clothing and ointments would hold up against a mustard gas attack, what doses would incapacitate a soldier in a tropical climate, and whether people of different racial backgrounds reacted differently to chemical weapons exposure. These questions, particularly the last one, were not scientifically legitimate by any standard of research ethics that existed at the time. They were rooted in the same racial assumptions that ran through every part of the U.S. military in that era, assumptions that had kept Black, Japanese American, and Puerto Rican troops in segregated units, assigned to cooking and driving duties rather than combat, on the basis that they were less capable than white soldiers. The experiments the military conducted between 1942 and 1945 took those assumptions and built a testing program around them. Over 60,000 American enlisted men were enrolled in secret experiments involving mustard gas and related chemical agents. Among them, at least 9 documented race-based experiments were conducted separately on Black, Japanese American, and Puerto Rican soldiers. White soldiers were used as control groups, meaning their reactions to the gas were recorded as the baseline definition of normal, and the minority soldiers were tested against that baseline to see how their responses differed. The program had never been publicly disclosed. It was not recorded in any of the men's official military service records. They were sworn to secrecy under direct threat of dishonorable discharge and military prison if they ever told anyone what had been done to them. That threat followed the men home after the war, into their civilian lives, into doctors' offices where they tried to explain skin conditions and breathing problems they could not legally describe because they had promised silence under penalty of imprisonment. 3 types of experiments were conducted. The first was patch testing, where liquid mustard gas was applied directly to the skin of the test subjects, poured or painted onto the forearm, then left to react. The second was field testing, where men were taken to outdoor areas that had been saturated with mustard gas and ordered to move through it, sometimes with protective clothing and sometimes without. The third was chamber testing, where men were locked inside enclosed wooden structures while mustard gas was piped in through vents. They could not leave. The doors were locked from the outside and only opened when the test time elapsed. Rollins Edwards was a Black soldier from South Carolina who went through the chamber test. He described being led into the chamber with a group of other Black soldiers, the door locking behind them, and then the gas beginning to fill the room. It felt like being on fire. Men started screaming and trying to force the door open. Some fainted. When the door finally opened, the men who came out were burned, disoriented, and sick. Edwards told the officers that they had explicitly informed him and the other Black soldiers that the purpose was to test what effect these gases would have on Black skin. He was not asked if he wanted to participate. Nobody asked. "You do what they tell you to do," Edwards said later, "and you ask no questions, especially if you are Black and in uniform in 1944. The field tests in the United States were conducted at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland,
Camp Seibert in Alabama, Bushnell Field in Florida, and Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, among other locations. The Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C. conducted additional experiments. Universities were also involved, including the University of Chicago's Toxicity Laboratory and Cornell University Medical College in New York. The race-based tests did not stay on American soil. A remote island off the coast of Panama in the Canal Zone called San Jose Island was the site of over 100 separate experiments conducted on Puerto Rican soldiers. The island was chosen specifically because its climate, hot, humid, tropical, closely resembled the conditions on islands across the Pacific where American forces were fighting and where chemical weapons might potentially be used. Military documents obtained by NPR described the primary function of the San Jose Project as gathering data on the behavior of lethal chemical agents. What actually happened there was Puerto Rican soldiers being sent into jungle terrain and then bombed with mustard gas from U.S. military planes flying overhead. Juan López Negron was one of those soldiers. He described the planes dropping the gas over the jungle while he and the other men were in the open. The animals left in the area, rabbits used as additional test subjects, all died. López Negron and the other soldiers were burned and fell ill almost immediately. He spent 3 weeks in a hospital recovering from fever and burns. Nearly all of the men who went through the San Jose experiments got sick. At Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, Japanese-American soldiers were used in a separate category of experiments. They were selected not because researchers believed they were particularly resistant to chemical agents, but because they were serving in the U.S. Army while the country was at war with Japan. Researchers wanted to use them as proxies, to study how mustard gas affected Japanese troops, on the theory that the physical characteristics of Japanese-American soldiers in some way approximated what Japanese enemy soldiers would experience. This was not a scientific proposition. It was race science dressed up in military language. In the spring of 1944, one documented study at Edgewood exposed 39 Japanese-American soldiers and 40 white soldiers to mustard gas and lewisite over the course of 20 days. Lewisite was a separate chemical weapon developed by the United States during World War I and stockpiled again for potential use in World War II. Like mustard gas, it causes severe blistering of the skin, damage to the respiratory system, and eye injuries. It was sometimes mixed with mustard gas in the chamber tests, which is what Rollins Edwards experienced. The underlying idea driving the race-based component of the entire program was framed by medical historian Susan Smith of the University of Alberta in a 2008 paper published in the Journal of Law, Medicine, and Ethics. Smith described the military's goal as finding what it called an ideal chemical soldier, a soldier whose body could withstand chemical attack better than others. The assumption was that Black and Puerto Rican soldiers might possess greater resistance to skin damage from chemical agents than white soldiers, and that if this could be confirmed, these men could be placed on front lines in chemical warfare scenarios while white soldiers remained behind. The war ended before any such tactical deployment occurred, but the research program behind it ran for years. When the war ended, the men went home. They told no one. The secrecy order remained in effect. The threat of dishonorable discharge and prison time did not expire with the armistice. None of the experiments were noted in their service records. When men developed skin conditions, chronic breathing problems, skin cancers, and lesions in the years and decades that followed, they had no documentation linking their symptoms to anything the military had done. Some could not even tell their own doctors what had happened, because the oath of secrecy they had taken still technically bound them. They were injured by their own government and then legally prevented from explaining how. In 1991, the federal government publicly acknowledged for the first time
that the U.S. military had conducted mustard gas experiments on American soldiers during World War II. When the program was formally declassified in 1993, the Department of Veterans Affairs made two explicit commitments. It would locate approximately 4,000 men who had been subjected to the most extreme tests, and it would provide disability compensation to those who had suffered permanent injuries. Neither commitment was kept. An NPR investigation published in June 2015 found that in over 20 years, the VA had contacted just 610 of those men, sending a single letter in the mail, and had denied claims from many who responded. The VA's official position was that it could not locate the others because military records from the experiments were incomplete. The records were incomplete in large part because the experiments had been deliberately kept out of official service files from the beginning. The military had created the problem of missing records and then used the absence of those records as the reason it could not provide benefits to the men it had harmed. Edwards carried a jar filled with flakes of skin that fell from his body, remnants of the chemical burns, for years after the war, bringing it with him when he tried to convince anyone who would listen that something had been done to him. More than 70 years after the exposure, his skin still broke out in the same places, still fell away in flakes, still showed the damage from the days spent locked inside a gas chamber or crawling through fields soaked in a substance his own government had deployed against him. In July 2015, members of Congress sent a formal letter to the Secretary of Defense asking that the department notify Black, Puerto Rican, and Japanese American veterans that they had been specifically chosen for these experiments and that they were unjustly selected on the basis of race. In August 2017, Congress passed legislation creating a new process for processing claims from veterans exposed to mustard gas during World War II, acknowledging that the VA had failed these men for 7 decades. By that point, most of them were dead. None of the officials who authorized the race-based testing program were ever disciplined. No investigation was conducted into the individuals who designed the experiments. The program's scientific conclusions, that racial differences in response to mustard gas were measurable, were never validated by independent review and are not accepted by modern medicine. The men who provided the data for those conclusions were never formally compensated as a group, never publicly apologized to as a group, and in many cases, never even told during their lifetimes that the reason they had been chosen was the color of their skin. The mustard gas experiments exposed men to a chemical weapon their own military locked them inside a room with. The next experiment on this list did something even quieter. It took children who were already sick, already scared, and already trusting the adults in white coats around them, and fed them radioactive food for breakfast. Experiment 6, the Fernald State School Science Club. Radioactive oatmeal fed to disabled children by MIT and Harvard, 1946 to 1956. The Walter E. Fernald State School sits on 186 acres in Waltham, Massachusetts, about 10 miles west of Boston. It was founded in 1848 as the Massachusetts School for the Feeble-Minded, the oldest publicly funded institution for people with developmental disabilities in the Western Hemisphere. By the 1940s, when the experiments in this case began, the school had grown into a sprawling campus of more than 70 buildings that housed nearly 2,000 residents. At its peak in the 1960s, that number would reach 2,600. The children inside were not all intellectually disabled. Estimates from multiple investigations, including reporting by the Boston Globe and assessments by state panels, indicate that approximately half of the residents tested with IQ scores in the normal range. They were there because they were poor, because they had been orphaned,
because their parents could not care for them, or because they had been born into circumstances that gave the state grounds to commit them. 36 children slept in each dormitory room. Staff were overwhelmed and underpaid. Reports of physical and sexual abuse by attendants were documented across multiple decades. Children were put to work doing manual labor, laundry, maintenance, farming, because the school depended on unpaid resident labor to function under its severely limited budget. Fred Boyce arrived at Fernald in 1949 at age 7. His mother had abandoned him, and he had been a ward of the state since he was 8 months old. He had lived in 7 different homes in 6 years before a court committed him to Fernald without a legal guardian present to speak for him. He later described what life there was like. He said, "The children thought for a long time that they belonged there, that they were some kind of people who were not supposed to have been born." He said the state government did not need to look for homes for them, so it dumped them at Fernald and let them rot. Into this environment, an institution full of children with no families, no advocates, no legal protection, and no power to refuse, came researchers from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Harvard University, with a proposal and a grant from the Quaker Oats Company. In the mid-1940s, Quaker Oats and Cream of Wheat were competing for cereal market share. Both companies were also facing a scientific problem. Researchers had found that plant-based grains contain high levels of a naturally occurring acid called phytate, which inhibits the body's ability to absorb iron and calcium. Quaker wanted to know whether its oatmeal was as nutritionally effective as competing grain cereals, specifically whether phytate in oats blocked iron and calcium absorption more than the phytate in other cereals. This was a commercial question with a commercial answer attached to it. To get that answer, Quaker approached MIT. MIT professor of nutrition Robert S. Harris agreed to lead the study. In December 1945, Harris wrote a letter to the superintendent of the Fernald School proposing the research and assuring him there was absolutely no ground for caution regarding the quantities of radioactive substances that would be used in the experiments. The radioactive isotopes needed for the work were supplied by the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, the same federal agency overseeing the nuclear weapons program. The AEC provided radioactive iron-59 and calcium-47, both of which could be added to food and then tracked through the body using radiation detectors. By tagging the iron and calcium with radioactive isotopes, researchers could follow exactly where the nutrients went and how much the body absorbed. The research design required test subjects who could be strictly controlled, who would eat every bite of what was given to them, produce excretions that could be collected in full, stay in one place, and not ask questions. MIT identified the Fernald boys as exactly what they needed. In a Senate hearing decades later, one MIT researcher explained the selection plainly. "You cannot conduct this kind of study unless you have complete control of your subjects." The children at Fernald could not leave. They ate what they were given. Their output could be collected. To recruit the boys for the experiments, MIT and the Fernald School created something called the Science Club. Boys who joined the Science Club received special privileges. They got larger food portions. They went to parties. They received small gifts, Mickey Mouse watches, mugs with cartoon characters on them. They got trips off the school grounds to Boston Red Sox and Boston Braves baseball games. In an institution where leaving the grounds was almost never permitted, where daily life consisted of forced labor, cramped dormitories, and the constant threat of physical punishment, the offer of a baseball game was not a minor incentive. Fred Boyce later said that had the researchers offered him an outing in exchange for taking arsenic, his hand would have been up immediately. The boys were told they were members of a special club that was studying nutrition and science for their benefit. None of them were told the food contained radioactive material. The letters sent to their parents or guardians described the club as a program to improve the nutrition of the children and help them in general more efficiently than before. The letters did not use the word radiation. They did not describe isotopes, tracers, or any element of what the research actually involved. Parents who did not actively object within a certain time frame were treated as having consented on behalf of their children. The letter was structured as an opt-out. Silence was recorded as agreement. From 1946 to 1956, over 100 boys at Fernald between the ages of 10 and 17 participated in 3 separate experiments. In the first, the boys ate oatmeal and milk that had been laced with radioactive iron-59. In the second, they ate oatmeal and milk with radioactive calcium-47. In the third, 9 boys received direct intravenous injections of radioactive calcium into their bloodstreams. Researchers collected urine samples, blood samples, and stool samples from the boys after every meal to track how much of the radioactive material the body absorbed and how much it expelled. The boys were required to consume every bite of the radioactive food. Not a single drop could be wasted, because partial consumption would compromise the data. The scientific results were clear, and, for Quaker Oats, commercially useful. Oatmeal was found to be no worse than cream of wheat in terms of how much it inhibited iron and calcium absorption. The calcium injection experiments produced the finding that calcium absorbed into the bloodstream goes directly into the bones, research that later formed the scientific foundation for studies of osteoporosis. These findings were published in scientific journals without any mention that the subjects were institutionalized children who had received no meaningful explanation of what was being done to them. The experiments remained unknown to the public for nearly 5 decades. The boys grew up, left Fernald, and went on with their lives carrying no knowledge of what had been in their breakfast bowls. Fred Boyce left in 1960 at age 19 with almost no education and no practical skills for civilian life. He could not read. He joined the carnival circuit and traveled the country. His friend, Joe Almeida, who had also been a science club member, eventually returned to Fernald as an adult and worked there as a driver for 20 years. He said he always felt they owed him something, because they had taken the most important years of his life. On December 26, 1993, the day after Christmas, Boston Globe journalist Scott Allen published an article titled "Radiation Used on Retarded." Allen had obtained documents that the Department of Energy had just declassified as part of Energy Secretary Hazel O'Leary's Openness Initiative. The article named the Fernald School experiments directly and described what had been done to the children. Fred Boyce turned on his car radio one morning in 1994 and heard a report about the story. He later said he yelled that it could not be right, because that was him. The Senate Committee on Labor and Human Resources held hearings in January 1994, chaired by Senator Edward Kennedy. Kennedy asked MIT's Dean of Research, David Litzter, why the researchers had not conducted the study on MIT students or children at private schools. Kennedy asked whether Litzter was appalled that the most vulnerable people in society, children as young as 7 and 8 years old living in an institution, had been the ones selected. Litzter told the committee that the radiation doses the boys had received were between 170 and 330 millirems, roughly the equivalent of 30 consecutive chest X-rays, and that this gave each child a roughly 1 in 2,000 chance of developing cancer, barely above the national baseline. A 1994 Massachusetts State Task Force confirmed that none of the students appeared to have suffered direct health damage from the isotopes. The task force nevertheless concluded that the experiments were unethical and had violated the human rights of the children. In October 1995,
President Clinton apologized formally to the Science Club members as part of a broader federal apology for government-sponsored radiation experiments. In December 1995, a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of 30 former Fernald students against MIT and Quaker Oats in U.S. District Court. In 1997, MIT and Quaker Oats agreed to pay a combined settlement of $1.85 million. MIT paid the larger share. Quaker Oats paid a smaller portion. Each former student who filed a claim received between $20,000 and $30,000, depending on how many individuals ultimately came forward. MIT stated publicly that its researchers had acted properly under the existing standards of conduct. It agreed to the settlement to avoid the expense of a prolonged legal case. The researcher who led the calcium studies, Konstantin Maletskos, told journalists after the story broke that he felt just as good about the research on the day he was asked as on the day it was done. He said the scientists had tried to give the children the minimum possible radiation dose while still making the experiment work. Jacob Shapiro, the director of radiation protection at Harvard University, declined to assess whether the doses had been dangerous, but said he would ask any colleague who worked on the study, "Would you let your own child receive that dose?" Nobody had asked the children. Nobody had asked their parents in any meaningful way. The Atomic Energy Commission, which provided the radioactive isotopes, knew what they were being used for. MIT knew. Quaker Oats knew. The school superintendent knew. The children sitting at those breakfast tables eating their Quaker oatmeal did not know, and were not going to be told, because the whole point of choosing them was that they could not leave the table. The Fernald experiments used children who had no one to protect them and no way to refuse. The next experiment on this list also used an institution full of people with no way out. But the men in this case were not children. They were patients in a hospital, healthy enough to believe they were there to be treated, and they were being deliberately infected with one of the most destructive diseases a human being could carry. Experiment 7. The Willowbrook Hepatitis Experiments, deliberately infecting disabled children to study a disease, 1956 to 1971. Willowbrook State School opened on October 11, 1947, on a 375-acre campus in the Willowbrook neighborhood of Staten Island, New York. The site had previously been used as a U.S. Army hospital during World War II. After the war, the New York State Department of Mental Hygiene converted it into a residential facility for children with intellectual disabilities. It was designed to house 4,000 people. That number was never respected. By the mid-1950s, the population had already pushed past 6,000. Budget cuts removed hundreds of staff positions, leaving a ratio of roughly 1 attendant for every 50 residents. Residents lived in severely overcrowded dormitories, often without adequate clothing. Sanitary facilities were insufficient for the volume of people. Children who could not toilet themselves went unbathed and unclothed for extended periods. Physical and sexual abuse by staff was documented repeatedly over the institution's history, but rarely addressed. Former resident Bernard Carabello later described being beaten with sticks and belt buckles and being kicked into walls by staff members. He said sexual abuse by both staff and other residents was widespread. In these conditions, disease spread constantly and rapidly. Hepatitis in particular moved through Willowbrook so efficiently that researchers determined 90% of children admitted to the institution contracted the virus within a short time of their arrival. The virus spread through fecal matter, contaminating the food and surfaces that children touched and put in their mouths. In an overcrowded facility with insufficient staffing and inadequate sanitation, there was essentially no way to prevent it. Dr. Saul Krugman was a pediatrician and professor of epidemiology at New York University Medical School. He was brought in to address Willowbrook's disease problem in the mid-1950s. Krugman held legitimate scientific credentials and would later make significant contributions to hepatitis research and vaccine development. In the 1970s and 1980s, he received multiple professional honors, including the Mary Woodard Lasker Public Service Award in 1983. He was also the principal investigator of what the celebrated vaccinologist Maurice Hilleman later called the most unethical medical experiments ever performed on children in the United States. Krugman's reasoning for conducting the experiments was stated openly in his own published papers. He observed that children admitted to Willowbrook were going to contract hepatitis anyway, due to the conditions in the institution. Therefore, deliberately infecting newly admitted children under controlled medical supervision was not meaningfully different from allowing natural infection to occur, except that the deliberate infections happened in a clean ward with close medical monitoring, which, he argued, gave the children better care than they would receive in the general population of the institution. He further argued that by studying the disease in a controlled way, he could develop insights that would eventually lead to a vaccine, helping a far larger population than the children he was using. The experiments ran from 1956 to 1971. The research was sponsored by the Armed Forces Epidemiological Board, which operated under the Office of the Surgeon General of the U.S. Army, and was approved by the New York State Department of Mental Hygiene. Krugman and his team collected feces from Willowbrook residents who had contracted hepatitis, extracted the virus from those samples, diluted the infected material in chocolate milk or other food, and fed it to newly admitted, healthy children. In one documented series of experiments, 60 healthy children were fed live hepatitis virus extracted from the stool of infected Willowbrook residents. All 60 contracted the disease. Krugman watched as their skin and eyes turned yellow, their livers enlarged, and they vomited and refused food. Some fell severely ill. The experiments produced genuine scientific findings. Krugman's work was the first to definitively distinguish between two separate strains of hepatitis. He labeled them MS1 and MS2, taken from the initials of a patient whose blood samples were used in 7 trials. MS1 had a shorter incubation period of 30 to 38 days and spread through oral contact. MS2 had an incubation period of 41 to 108 days and spread through blood. These were eventually confirmed as the viruses we now call hepatitis A and hepatitis B, a distinction that transformed medicine's understanding of liver disease and laid groundwork for the development of vaccines that are used worldwide today. The science was real. The ethical violations were also real. Consent at Willowbrook was not obtained through a process anyone could reasonably call voluntary. Krugman's team sent letters to the parents of children applying for admission, explaining that a research program was studying hepatitis and asking for the parents' consent to enroll their child. What the letters did not fully explain was that participation meant deliberate infection with a disease that caused liver damage, jaundice, and severe illness. Between 1963 and 1966, in a period when Willowbrook had declared it was closed to new admissions due to overcrowding, the hepatitis research ward continued to admit new subjects. The general institution was full. The only open beds in the building were in the hepatitis ward. Parents who could not care for a disabled child at home and had no other placement available were told there was no room for their child at Willowbrook, unless they agreed to enroll the child in the study. Agreeing to the hepatitis experiments was, functionally, the condition of admission. This coercive structure was documented and criticized in the medical literature at the time. In 1966, Dr. Henry Beecher of Harvard Medical School published a landmark article in the New England Journal of Medicine listing 22 examples of ethically questionable research being conducted in the United States.
The Willowbrook experiments were included. The article did not name the researchers by name, but described the study precisely enough that any physician who read it would recognize it. Beecher's article is considered one of the founding documents of modern research ethics, and Willowbrook was on its list. In 1971, Dr. Stephen Goldby published a letter in the British medical journal The Lancet directly criticizing Krugman's work by name. Goldby argued that no child should be subjected to an experiment that provides no benefit to that child, regardless of parental consent and regardless of whatever future benefits the research might produce for others. He wrote that the duty of a pediatrician in Willowbrook's situation was to try to improve the conditions causing the hepatitis epidemic, not to turn those conditions to his advantage for experimental purposes. Krugman's colleague, Dr. Joan Giles, published a response in the same journal defending the research. She compared the children to corn seedlings being moved from poor soil to better soil. The same action, she argued, could be judged very differently depending on the motive. By 1965, the institution had become impossible to ignore at the public level. Senator Robert F. Kennedy made an unannounced visit to Willowbrook that year and described what he found. 6,000 residents were living in filth and dirt, their clothing in rags, in rooms less comfortable and cheerful than the cages in which animals are kept in a zoo. He called it a snake pit. The state of New York issued a 5-year improvement plan. The conditions did not meaningfully improve. The exposure that finally generated sustained national attention came in early 1972, when Geraldo Rivera, then an investigative reporter for WABC-TV in New York, was given access to the institution by Dr. Michael Wilkins, a staff member who had been dismissed. Rivera filmed what he found. His documentary, titled Willowbrook: The Last Great Disgrace, was broadcast to a national audience. Rivera described in his narration that the institution smelled of filth, of disease, and of death. The footage showed residents unclothed and unwashed, sitting or lying in wards with one attendant visible for dozens of people. The only sound his camera crew recorded in one ward was an eerie communal wail. The documentary won Rivera a Peabody Award and drew a response that Kennedy's visit 7 years earlier had failed to produce. On March 17, 1972, a class-action lawsuit was filed against the state of New York in federal court on behalf of the parents of 5,000 Willowbrook residents. The case went to trial in October 1974 and was settled in April 1975 through a consent decree signed by federal judge Orrin Judd. The decree ordered humane treatment and adequate clinical and educational services for all residents. It mandated a reduction from 6,000 residents to 250 by 1981. The hepatitis experiments had already ended in 1971 under public and professional pressure. The institution itself continued operating until September 17, 1987, when the last children were transferred out. The publicity generated by the Willowbrook case was a direct contributing factor to the passage of the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act of 1980, which gave the federal government legal standing to investigate and act on systemic abuses in institutions receiving federal funding. The Willowbrook experiments also became a central case in the development of modern research ethics guidelines, appearing on syllabi in medical schools and bioethics programs alongside Tuskegee and the Nazi doctors' trials. Krugman received his Lasker Award in 1983, 11 years after Rivera's broadcast. He died in 1995 and maintained until the end of his life that the experiments had been ethical given the conditions at Willowbrook and the scientific value of the results. No charges were ever brought. No licenses were revoked. The Armed Forces Epidemiological Board, which funded the research, never issued a statement acknowledging that the consent process had been coercive. What the Willowbrook case permanently established was that the scientific legitimacy of an experiment's results does not determine the ethical legitimacy of the methods used to obtain them. The children who were fed infected stool extracts in chocolate milk were not going to live to see the hepatitis B vaccine that their suffering helped produce. They were sick children in an overcrowded warehouse on Staten Island, and they had no meaningful choice in what was done to them.
Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While the Willowbrook experiments used children who were already inside an institution, the next experiment on this list recruited people who walked into a building in good health, trusting the government doctors waiting for them, and were sent home carrying something they would not understand for years. Experiment 8. The Army's 239 secret biological and chemical warfare tests on American cities, 1949 to 1969. The U.S. biological warfare program was built on a straightforward problem. By the late 1940s, military planners knew that biological and chemical weapons existed and could be deployed against American cities from the air or sea. What they did not know with precision was how those weapons would actually behave over a real urban area, how the particles would spread in wind, how far they would travel, what dose an average city resident would receive, and how many tons of material a hostile power would need to do serious damage. The only way to answer those questions accurately was to run tests in real cities with real weather and real populations. So they did. Between 1949 and 1969, the U.S. Army and Navy conducted 239 open-air tests of biological and chemical agents across the United States and Canada. In 80 of those tests, the military released live bacteria into the air above populated areas. In the remainder, it used chemical particles designed to mimic the spread of biological agents. In almost every case, the people living in the targeted cities were told nothing. They breathed in whatever was released above them, went home, fed their children dinner, and woke up the next morning with no idea that their government had been studying them the way a scientist studies a laboratory animal. The first test was not on a city. It was on the largest office building in the world. In August 1949, operatives from the Army's Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick disguised themselves as maintenance workers, entered the Pentagon, and released bacteria into the building's air handling and ventilation system. They then watched as the bacteria spread through all 5 sections of the building. The test confirmed that a building the size of the Pentagon could be saturated with a biological agent through its own ventilation system by a small number of people working covertly. The program then moved to larger targets. The first major outdoor urban test came in April 1950, when Navy warships sprayed bacteria over the cities of Norfolk, Hampton, and Newport News in Virginia. Then, in September 1950, came Operation Sea Spray in San Francisco, already covered as Experiment 3. After that, the program accelerated. Researchers at Fort Detrick's Special Operations Division worked through the 1950s and 1960s, building a body of data on how biological weapons would perform in different American cities under different weather conditions, and they chose their test sites based on military calculations about Soviet targets, not on any assessment of risk to the people who lived there. The most extensively tested American city was St. Louis, Missouri. The Army selected St. Louis specifically because of its resemblance to Moscow. In documents later obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, the National Research Council confirmed that St. Louis was chosen as a test site because its population density, terrain, river access, and climate most closely matched Soviet cities that the U.S. military had identified as potential biological attack targets. St. Louis was not chosen for convenience.
It was chosen because its people lived in conditions that most closely mirrored the people the U.S. military was planning to attack in the Soviet Union. Beginning in 1953, Army operatives arrived in St. Louis and began deploying motorized blowers on the rooftops of buildings in the city's residential neighborhoods. They mounted spray devices in the back of station wagons and drove them slowly through the streets. They installed equipment on the 33 concrete towers of the Pruitt-Igoe housing development, a public housing complex in North St. Louis that housed roughly 10,000 residents, the majority of whom were black. The Army's own documents described the area around Pruitt-Igoe as a densely populated slum district. According to a researcher who later studied the program, an estimated 70% of the residents at Pruitt-Igoe at the time of the spraying were children under the age of 12. The substance being sprayed was zinc cadmium sulfide. It is a fine powder composed of zinc, cadmium, and sulfur. The particles were roughly 2 to 3 micrometers in size, similar to the size of bacteria, and glowed bright yellow under ultraviolet light, making them easy to track with detectors stationed around the city. The Army chose zinc cadmium sulfide because it behaved like bacteria in the air. It was not itself a biological weapon, but cadmium, one of its 3 components, is a heavy metal that has been classified as a carcinogen by health authorities. At the time of the tests, the Army maintained that zinc cadmium sulfide was harmless. That claim has been contested. When residents of St. Louis noticed men in what appeared to be protective suits on the rooftops of their buildings and saw the machines releasing clouds of powder into the air, they were given an explanation. The Army was testing an invisible smoke screen designed to shield American cities from Soviet radar in the event of a nuclear attack. That explanation was false. The tests had nothing to do with smoke screens or radar. They were dispersal experiments for offensive biological weapons development, designed to determine how much material would be needed to kill or incapacitate the population of a city the size of Moscow. The St. Louis tests were not isolated. The same program ran in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where the Army used aircraft, rooftop blowers, and ground-based vehicles to spray zinc cadmium sulfide through residential neighborhoods. Minneapolis was also selected as a Soviet city analog. The Army's documents from the early 1950s show that Minneapolis and St. Louis were chosen together because they bracketed the range of climate conditions in the upper Mississippi Valley that matched Soviet target cities in winter and summer, respectively. In some Minneapolis tests, the chemical powder visibly drifted through school buildings. Local officials were told the spraying involved harmless smoke screens, not chemicals. In 1957 and 1958, the Army ran a much larger operation called Operation LAC, Large Area Coverage. The Air Force loaned the Army a C-119 flying boxcar transport aircraft. The plane flew 400-mile flight lines, releasing 5,000 pounds of zinc cadmium sulfide per run from the air. The first test ran on December 2, 1957, along a path from South Dakota to International Falls, Minnesota. Monitoring stations on the ground tracked where the particles went. Some traveled 1,200 miles, reaching stations in New York State. Total flight time for Operation LAC across fiscal year 1958 was around 100 hours, including 4 separate runs of various lengths. One run covered 1,400 miles. The testing was not limited to outdoor, open-air environments. In June 1966, the Army's Special Operations Division carried out an experiment inside the New York City subway system. Operatives dropped light bulbs filled with Bacillus subtilis, a bacterium the Army considered harmless at the time, onto the tracks at stations in Midtown Manhattan. As trains passed over the broken bulbs, the bacteria were carried throughout the subway system by the air displacement from the trains. A participant in the experiment named Wally Paneer later acknowledged that the bacteria spread well because a natural aerosol was created every few minutes by each passing train.
The Army's own report on the experiment concluded that similar covert attacks with a disease-causing agent during peak traffic periods could expose enormous numbers of people to infection, illness, or death. In May 1965, the program targeted Washington, D.C. directly. Army operatives released bacteria at Washington's National Airport and its adjacent Greyhound bus terminal. More than 130 passengers at those locations were exposed and then boarded aircraft and buses, traveling to 39 cities across 7 states over the 2 weeks following the mock attack. The Army recorded where those passengers went and what the spread pattern looked like. The conclusion of that experiment was that a small-scale biological attack on a single transportation hub could distribute a pathogen across a large portion of the eastern United States within a matter of days. The American public did not learn that any of these tests had taken place until 1977, when Army officials testified before a Senate subcommittee and disclosed the 239 test program for the first time. By then, the testing had been over for 8 years. President Nixon had formally ended the U.S. offensive biological weapons program on November 25, 1969, and most of the records from the tests had been classified or lost. The Senate disclosure came 28 years after the first test at the Pentagon in 1949. For the residents of Pruitt-Igoe, the revelation took longer still. The government released documents in 1994 showing the specific details of the St. Louis spraying, following a document request by Missouri Representative Richard Gephardt. The documents confirmed that the Army had used the Pruitt-Igoe housing development as a primary spray site, had described the neighborhood as a slum district in its own records, and had chosen it not for any safety reason, but because it was the best available analog for a Soviet city on American soil. Ben Phillips was 5 years old when he moved into Pruitt-Igoe. He grew up watching the machines on the rooftops release their clouds into the air and believing the story about smokescreens. He said later that they were subjects, that it was a plan, and that it was not an accident. By 2023, he and other former Pruitt-Igoe residents had formed an organization called PACTS, Pruitt-Igoe Historical Accounting, Compensation, and Truth-Seeking, and were pursuing compensation from the federal government. As of 2023, the Army maintained in a statement that all health assessments had concluded the exposure posed no health risk and that no evidence of a radioactive component to the zinc-cadmium sulfide tests existed. The National Research Council's 1997 review, which the Army cited as authoritative, acknowledged in its own text that some of the key Army records were still classified and that others were missing. The review did not include independent site testing or health monitoring of former residents. It was based on what the Army provided. No one was ever compensated for the 239 tests. No official apology was issued to the residents of St. Louis, Minneapolis, New York, Washington, Norfolk, or any of the other cities used. The men who ordered the tests, the scientists who designed them, and the contractors who carried them out were never called to account in any legal proceeding. The testing program used hundreds of thousands of Americans as experimental subjects across 20 years. The next experiment on this list used only a single group of men, chosen by profession, asked to go to a place they trusted, and quietly irradiated in ways that would take decades to come fully to light. Experiment 9. The Atomic Veterans. U.S. soldiers ordered to march through nuclear blast zones, 1951 to 1957. The Nevada test site sits in a dry desert basin about 65 miles northwest of Las Vegas. The federal government acquired the land in 1950
and designated it as the place where the United States would detonate nuclear weapons on American soil. The first test at the site, a bomb with a yield of 1 kiloton, was detonated on January 27, 1951, as part of Operation Ranger. Between 1951 and 1962, the U.S. government conducted 100 atmospheric nuclear tests there, meaning bombs detonated in the open air above the surface, where their blast, heat, and radiation spread freely across the surrounding desert. From the very beginning of atmospheric testing at the Nevada site, the military brought its own soldiers to watch. The program was called Desert Rock. Between 1951 and 1957, tens of thousands of American military personnel, men from the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, were transported to the Nevada desert and positioned in the vicinity of nuclear detonations. The stated purpose of Desert Rock was to train troops for combat on a nuclear battlefield and to study how soldiers responded, physically and psychologically, to the experience of witnessing a nuclear explosion at close range. Across the full run of the program, approximately 400,000 servicemen participated in atmospheric nuclear tests in some capacity, whether at the Nevada test site, in the Pacific, or in other locations. The standard procedure in the Desert Rock exercises was as follows. Troops were taken to Camp Desert Rock, established 1.5 miles south of Camp Mercury at the Nevada test site in 1951. Before a scheduled detonation, soldiers were positioned in trenches dug into the desert floor. Depending on the specific test and the expected yield, those trenches could be anywhere from 2 to 7 miles from the detonation point. Soldiers were given basic instructions: crouch down, turn their backs toward the explosion, bow their heads, and cover their eyes. Many were given only standard utility jackets, helmets, and gas masks. No specialized protective equipment was provided. Film badges, small devices worn on the body that measured radiation exposure, were issued to some but not all participants. Many of those badges were later reported as damaged or lost. When the bomb detonated, the light came first. Veterans who witnessed these tests described it consistently across decades. The flash was brighter than anything they had ever seen. Several described being able to see the bones and veins in their own hands through their closed eyelids and covered eyes. Rex Montgomery, who was present at the Hood test during Operation Plum Bob in 1957, later recalled that you could visually see your bones, the way you would in an X-ray. The heat followed the light. Then came the overpressure wave, the blast, which knocked soldiers off their feet in the trenches. Then the mushroom cloud rose. After the blast cleared and monitoring personnel swept the area with Geiger counters, troops were ordered to advance toward Ground Zero. In some exercises, infantry units marched through terrain still contaminated with radioactive fallout to practice attacking positions in a post-nuclear battlefield environment. In others, soldiers were bussed closer to the blast site to observe the effects of the explosion on military equipment and test structures that had been set up in advance. The closest approach in some exercises brought soldiers to within 900 meters of the point directly beneath the detonation. Decontamination procedures, when they existed at all, were minimal. Thomas Saffer, a U.S. Marine who was present at the Priscilla test during Operation Plum Bob in 1957, later described what happened when he and other soldiers came back from the contaminated area. A radiological safety officer came with a Geiger counter and held it over the men. The soldiers could hear it clicking. Then, one man on each side of the line dusted them off with a broom. That was the decontamination. The prevailing assumption was that if you removed the visible dust from a person's uniform and skin, you removed the radiation. That assumption was wrong. The single most significant test series in terms of later health consequences was Operation Plumb Bob, which ran from May 28 to October 7, 1957, at the Nevada test site. Plumb Bob consisted of 29 nuclear detonations. It was the largest and longest test series ever conducted in the continental United States.
Approximately 18,000 members of the Air Force, Army, Navy, and Marines participated in the Desert Rock 7 and 8 exercises during Plumb Bob. Military commanders explicitly stated that one of their goals was to understand how the average foot soldier would hold up, physically and psychologically, under the conditions of a tactical nuclear battlefield. Operation Plumb Bob released 58,300 kilocuries of radioiodine, iodine-131, into the atmosphere. That single test series produced total civilian radiation exposures amounting to approximately 120 million person-rads of thyroid tissue exposure, which was roughly 32% of all civilian exposure caused by all continental nuclear tests combined. Scientists later estimated that this level of exposure would statistically be expected to cause between 11,000 and 212,000 excess cases of thyroid cancer, leading to between 1,000 and 20,000 deaths among civilians who lived downwind of the Nevada site. Among the tests in Plumb Bob, the one that drew the most sustained medical attention in subsequent decades was Shot Smoky, detonated at 5:30 in the morning on August 31, 1957. Smoky had a yield of 44 kilotons. It was fired from a 700-foot tower above Yucca Flat. An estimated 3,000 soldiers participated in the Desert Rock exercises associated with Smoky. The closest troops observed the detonation from trenches 13 kilometers southwest of Ground Zero. After the blast, an attack and resupply maneuver involving approximately 1,150 troops was conducted in the vicinity of Ground Zero. The closest approach during post-shot maneuvers was 4,100 meters west of the detonation point. 22 years later, in 1979, a team from the Centers for Disease Control published a study examining the health outcomes of the 3,224 military personnel who had been present at the Nevada test site during the Smoky test. The researchers found a significantly elevated number of leukemia cases among these veterans. 10 cases of leukemia were identified among the Smoky participants, compared to the statistically expected baseline of 4 cases for a comparable unexposed population of the same size. A 1980 study confirmed the elevated rates. The finding triggered congressional inquiries and launched a broader epidemiological program to examine the health of atomic veterans across all test series. Joel Healy was a 17-year-old Army private first class when he was stationed at Camp Desert Rock in 1957 and participated in Operation Plumb Bob. He drove dump trucks, moved materials, and helped construct the tower structures from which some of the bombs were detonated. He was told he would not be in harm's way. The official slogan of the era was "Atoms for Peace." Decades later, Healy described what he had been asked to do. He said the Army had its own film teams there to show troops marching, whistling into a nuclear device. He called what was done to the men a disgrace. The soldiers who participated in Desert Rock were sworn to secrecy. Under the terms they were given, they faced a $10,000 fine or 10 years in prison if they disclosed what they had witnessed. Many of the men who later developed cancer, radiation-related illnesses, or other serious conditions could not tell their doctors what they had been exposed to. They had no documentation. Their participation in the nuclear tests was not recorded in their official service files. When they tried to seek compensation from the Veterans Administration in the 1970s and 1980s, many were denied on the grounds that the government asserted they had not been exposed to unsafe levels of radiation. The VA's initial compensation guidelines recognized only 8 specific cancer types as radiation-linked. 2 African-American veterans, named A.C. Bird and James Gate, were among the first to publicly break the silence about the atomic veterans' experiences in the 1970s. They helped organize a movement that brought veterans before Congress throughout the 1970s and 1980s, testifying about what they had experienced and what they had been denied. The National Association of Radiation Survivors filed a lawsuit in 1983. The fight took years. In 1988, the Radiation Exposed Veterans Compensation Act was passed, providing a presumption of eligibility for disability benefits for veterans who developed certain specified cancers after participating in nuclear tests. 2 years later, on October 15, 1990, President George H.W. Bush signed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act into law. RECA provided one-time lump sum payments of $75,000 to atomic veterans who had participated in atmospheric nuclear tests and later developed qualifying cancers. The law stated explicitly that Congress apologized on behalf of the nation to individuals whose lives and health had been subjected to increased risk to serve the national security interests of the United States. As of 2023, RECA had paid out more than $2.6 billion in benefits to more than 41,000 claimants across all eligible categories: atomic veterans, civilian downwinders who lived near the test sites, and uranium miners and workers. The payments were one-time and not adjusted for inflation. The $75,000 figure set in 1990 remained unchanged for more than 30 years. In 2025, new legislation was passed expanding eligibility and increasing compensation amounts, partly in response to years of advocacy by surviving veterans and their families. A study published in the 1990s found that soldiers who had witnessed testing at the Nevada test site had a death rate from leukemia that was 50% higher than comparable groups of military personnel who had not worked with atomic testing. The Nevada test site studies also found elevated rates of nasal cancer and prostate cancer among test participants. The men sent into those desert trenches were not told they were part of an experiment. They were told they were training for war. But the military's own documents show that studying their psychological reactions to nuclear detonations, measuring how close troops could operate to a blast and still function, and gathering data on radiation exposure to live human subjects were explicit goals of the Desert Rock program from its first exercise in 1951. The soldiers believed they were serving their country. They were also, by any definition of the term, research subjects in a study they had not consented to and were not informed about. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Every case in this series has involved Americans who were either deceived, coerced, or simply not told what their government was doing to them. The final experiment on this list did not target soldiers or patients or children. It targeted an entire country, one that trusted its scientists and doctors to help them. Experiment 10. The Guatemala Syphilis Experiments. Deliberately infecting an entire country's prisoners, soldiers, and mental patients. 1946 to 1948. In 1947, while American prosecutors were in Nuremberg presenting evidence against Nazi doctors who had conducted experiments on concentration camp prisoners without consent, the United States government was running its own non-consensual infection experiments on prisoners, soldiers, psychiatric patients, and orphans in Guatemala. The two things were happening at the same time, the same year, the same nation whose officials were arguing before an international tribunal that experimenting on unconsenting human beings was a crime against humanity. The Guatemala experiments were not discovered for more than 60 years. When they finally came to light,
they came out the way many of these cases do. Not through a congressional investigation, not through a whistleblower, not through a government admission, but through a historian who was looking for something else entirely. The experiments began because of a practical military problem. During World War II, sexually transmitted diseases, primarily syphilis and gonorrhea, had caused enormous numbers of lost combat days in the U.S. military. The armed forces ran extensive prevention campaigns. By 1943, researchers had confirmed that penicillin was effective at curing syphilis, but a separate question remained unanswered. Could penicillin prevent the disease if it was given to someone immediately after exposure, before the infection had taken hold? Answering that question required deliberately exposing healthy people to the bacteria and then testing whether various treatments blocked infection. Researchers had already attempted this at a federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana, between 1943 and 1944, using prisoners who were promised money, a certificate of merit, and a letter to their parole board in exchange for participation. The results from Terre Haute were unreliable because the method of inducing infection, exposure through sexual contact, produced infection rates too low to generate usable data. The lead researcher on the Terre Haute experiments was a young U.S. Public Health Service doctor named John Charles Cutler, working under the supervision of Dr. John F. Mahoney. When the Terre Haute approach proved inadequate, they needed a different location, somewhere with a larger available population of subjects, with fewer legal protections, where it would be possible to infect people more directly and more reliably. A Guatemalan physician named Juan Funes, who had spent a fellowship year at the U.S. Public Health Service's Venereal Diseases Research Laboratory in 1945, told his American colleagues that prostitution was legal in Guatemala and that infected sex workers were permitted to visit men inside Guatemalan prisons. Guatemala was chosen. In March 1946, a National Institutes of Health study section approved the proposal for what it called the Guatemalan Study dealing with the experimental transmission of syphilis to human volunteers and improved methods of prophylaxis. The NIH provided $146,000 in funding to the Pan American Sanitary Bureau, which negotiated access to Guatemalan government institutions on behalf of the American researchers. That access included the National Prison, Army Barracks, Guatemala's only mental hospital, and the National Orphanage. Cutler arrived in Guatemala in August 1946 to begin the work. The initial approach used sex workers. Guatemalan women who worked in government-licensed prostitution were deliberately infected with syphilis or gonorrhea at government clinics under the control of the Guatemalan Ministry of Public Health, and then sent to have sexual contact with men in the national prison. This method produced an infection rate of less than 10%, far too low to conduct meaningful comparisons between treatment and no treatment. The study design had to change. Researchers switched to direct inoculation. They mixed syphilis bacteria taken from infected humans and animals with beef heart broth, distilled water, or spinal fluid to create a solution, and then applied it directly to the bodies of their subjects. One documented method involved scraping or abrading the skin of the penises of male prisoners and dripping the bacterial solution onto the raw flesh, holding it there for an hour or two. Other methods involved inserting the bacteria directly into the urethra through a syringe, injecting it into the forearm, or, in one case at the mental hospital, injecting syphilis directly below the base of a patient's skull. The bacterial solution was also inserted into eyes, rectums, and open sores. No subject was told what was being done. Consent was obtained from the institutions, from prison officials, military officers, and hospital administrators, not from the people whose bodies were being used. Some of those administrators were given supplies and equipment in exchange for their cooperation.
The single most detailed documented case from the Guatemala experiments involves a woman referred to in Cutler's records as Berta, a patient at the National Mental Hospital. In February 1948, Berta was injected with syphilis. A month later, she developed scabies, an itchy parasitic skin infection. In August 1948, Cutler observed that she appeared as if she was going to die, though his records do not specify why. On the same day he made that observation, Cutler inserted gonorrheal pus taken from a male patient directly into both of Berta's eyes, her urethra, and her rectum. He also reinfected her with syphilis. Several days later, her eyes were filled with pus from the gonorrhea infection, and she was bleeding from her urethra. Berta died on August 27, 1948. Cutler's supervisor, Dr. R.C. Arnold, wrote to him in 1948 acknowledging the nature of what was being done. Arnold wrote that he was more than a bit leery about the experiments with the insane people because they could not give consent, did not know what was happening, and if any organization got wind of it, they would raise a lot of smoke. The experiments continued. The results were never published. The full written report on the Guatemala study was sealed in Cutler's personal papers. Cutler participated in the Guatemala experiments until December 1948, when the study was abruptly ended. One stated reason for the termination was that Surgeon General Thomas Perrin, who had authorized the experiments and was aware of their scope, was about to leave his position. Perrin had himself acknowledged in writing that such experiments could not be done in the United States. The research that could not be done at home had been done abroad, on a population with no legal recourse, in a country whose government had been given access to medical supplies and equipment in exchange for institutional cooperation. Across the full scope of the Guatemala experiments, a total of 1,308 people were deliberately infected with syphilis, gonorrhea, or chancroid, a bacterial infection of the genitals that causes painful sores. Of those 1,308 people, only 678, or roughly 52%, received any form of treatment. The total population involved in all aspects of the experiments, including those subjected to blood testing and serological studies without being deliberately infected, was more than 5,500. The subjects ranged in age from 10 to 72. 83 of the participants died during the course of the study, though the records do not establish how many of those deaths were directly caused by the infections. Approximately 600 Guatemalan soldiers were infected with gonorrhea over the course of the study. Children at the National Orphanage were not deliberately infected, but were used for blood testing and serological verification without consent. Cutler went on to have a distinguished career. He became acting chief of the Venereal Disease Program in the U.S. Public Health Service. He was involved in the ongoing Tuskegee syphilis study from the 1960s until its termination in 1972. He became a professor at the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Public Health. In 1990, he donated his research papers to the university archive, apparently not believing they would cause a problem. He died on February 8, 2003, at age 87, without the Guatemala experiments ever having become public knowledge. He appeared in a 1993 documentary about Tuskegee and continued defending that study. In 2005, Susan Reverby, a medical historian at Wellesley College, was conducting research at the University of Pittsburgh archive for her book about the Tuskegee experiment. She went to examine the papers of Thomas Perrin, who had been the Surgeon General during the early years of Tuskegee. She also pulled the boxes of Cutler's donated papers, expecting to find material about Tuskegee. She found nothing about Tuskegee. What she found were detailed records of the Guatemala study, Cutler's full reports, correspondence with his supervisors, photographs taken by his wife, documentation of the inoculation methods, and the case files of individual subjects,
including Berta. She later said she had been blown away by the discovery. Reeverbee made copies of the documents and returned to Wellesley. She worked on the material for several years while completing her Tuskegee book. In May 2010, she presented her findings at a meeting of the American Association for the History of Medicine in Rochester, Minnesota, to a small audience of historians. She then contacted David Sencer, a former director of the Centers for Disease Control, who passed the information through government channels. The CDC immediately sent a syphilis specialist to the University of Pittsburgh archive to verify the accuracy of Reeverbee's findings. The specialist confirmed them. On September 30, 2010, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton called Guatemalan President Alvaro Colom to inform him of what had happened. The following day, October 1, 2010, President Barack Obama called Colom directly to apologize. Clinton and Health and Human Services Secretary Kathleen Sebelius issued a joint statement calling the experiments clearly unethical and reprehensible research conducted under the guise of public health. The NIH director, Francis Collins, called the experiments a dark chapter in the history of medicine and an appalling example of what American regulations today would absolutely prohibit. Colom declared what had happened a crime against humanity and stated that Guatemala reserved the right to lodge a formal legal complaint. Obama directed the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues to conduct a thorough investigation. The commission published its findings in September 2011 under the title Ethically Impossible. It concluded that the experiments involved gross violations of ethics, as judged against both the standards of today and the researchers' own understanding. That last phrase was important. The commission was not saying that these experiments were wrong by modern standards only. It was saying that the people who ran them knew they were wrong at the time they were running them. The Surgeon General said explicitly that such experiments could not be done in the United States. The records showed supervisors expressing concern that the wrong people might find out. The results were never published. The Guatemalan subjects were never told what had happened to them. The files were sealed for 62 years. No one was ever prosecuted. No institution ever faced legal sanctions. Cutler died before the discovery. The Guatemalan subjects and their descendants filed multiple lawsuits in U.S. courts seeking compensation. Every one of those lawsuits was dismissed. Courts ruled that U.S. law did not provide a basis for foreign nationals to seek damages against the U.S. government for experiments conducted abroad, even experiments that the U.S. government itself had publicly acknowledged, apologized for, and described in its own commission report as ethically impossible. What connects all 10 experiments in this series is not simply that they were hidden. It is that they were hidden selectively, concealed from the people being experimented on and from the general public, while the people in charge knew exactly what they were doing and why it could not be done openly. In Tuskegee, the doctors published their findings in journals while hiding the true nature of the study from the men in Alabama. In Guatemala, Cutler sent detailed progress reports to his supervisors while the patients in the mental hospital had no idea why they were bleeding from their eyes. In the Atomic Veterans Program, the military filmed soldiers marching toward mushroom clouds to show the public while classifying the health data. In every case, the information traveled upward to the people with authority and never downward to the people with the most to lose. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.